for our fourth installment of our Intersections of Gender in Conversation series. I'm Susanne Luhmann, and I'm the director of Intersections of Gender, which is one of 5 signature areas of research and teaching here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. And I'm speaking today from Treaty 6 territory to you, which are the ancestral lands and the traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples and the lands of the Métis Nation Region 4. Acknowledging territory for me means doing more than a cursory acknowledgement. But by acknowledging territory, I suggest we make a commitment to learning about and understanding the responsibilities of treaties, such as recognizing nation-to-nation relationships. And acknowledging territory also means committing to learning about and respecting Indigenous knowledges and traditions, and engaging in research, teaching, and governance that will contribute to a wider acknowledgement of ongoing colonial violence. And I know that many of you are joining us today from different places in North America and beyond, and I invite you to reflect upon your own location and the responsibilities that come with living on and with the histories of land and the people who came before us. IG in Conversation is a series that we started this year to have more informal conversations with researchers about and often in response to current events as they are unfolding. So we started the series in April with a conversation about gendered aspects of COVID-19. And in May, we talked about COVID-19, racism, and masculinity. In June, we focused on COVID-19 and healthcare workers. And you can find these conversations on our webpage. So just look for Intersections of Gender. There you can access these files, video, sound, and text of these earlier events. So today I have the great pleasure to have with me my colleague, Dr. Lise Gotell, for a conversation on COVID-19 and gender-based violence. Lise is the Landrick's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Alberta, where she teaches, researches, and engages in policy advocacy on sexual violence, specifically its legal regulation. Her publications on sexual assault law have been widely cited, including by the Supreme Court of Canada and in law reform initiatives in Australia, New Zealand, England, Wales, and Scotland. And she is the past chair of the board of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund here in Canada. So welcome, Lise. It's a real pleasure to have you here. You are somehow muted. Why are you muted? This is very weird. Apologies, I'm trying to solve this.
No, it's fine. It's good.
Okay, good.
Before when I tried to unmute myself, it said that I wasn't allowed to do that, but now I can. So.
Great. I feel like this is the new welcome is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you please unmute you? So thank you so much for joining us today. So we will have about 35 minutes to 40 minutes for our conversation, and then we will open up to questions from our audience. So if audience members would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A function that you see on the bottom of your screen. I just got a phone call here. Sorry about this. This is all, there might be a dog moving through this picture in a moment. So in the chat, you should also find we will also post some support resources for those of you who are located in Canada. Okay, so Lise, let's kind of begin. So with the countries around the globe in lockdown and billions of people sheltering at home for months now to protect against COVID-19 and this pandemic, there are alarms being raised about rising rates of violence against women and girls. For example, the executive director of the United Nations Women, Phumzile Lamnam Nukukar, I hope I pronounced her name right, speaks of a shadow pandemic. Others describe this as a, quote, pandemic within a pandemic. Can you explain what is being meant by these terms?
Right. Well, of course, the World Health Organization had already declared gender-based violence to be a pandemic before COVID. So gender-based violence is really at pandemic levels. About 1/3 of women, 1 in 3 women will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. But of course, what we've seen in the context of COVID-19 is an intensification of all kinds of social inequalities, and along with that intensification, we've seen an increase in gender-based violence, affecting not only women and girls, but also when I talk about gender-based violence, I mean violence that affects women, girls, and also sexual and gender minorities as well. We don't yet have conclusive data, but the UN Population Fund has estimated that gender-based violence will escalate something like 20%, or has escalated something like 20%. And we've seen, you know, organizations in Canada reporting, vast increases in service use during the pandemic. So shelters and crisis centers in Toronto have seen their users increase by 30%, one by as much as 400%. In Vancouver, Battered Women's Support Services has first reported an increase of 50%, then 100%, and then 300%. The Native Women's Association of Canada has also done a grassroots survey of Indigenous women across the country, finding that of 250 women surveyed, 1 in 5 has experienced violence, gender violence, in the first 3 months of the pandemic. So yes, we're seeing a dramatic increase in gender-based violence. And again, it's called the shadow pandemic, or the pandemic within the pandemic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how specifically have isolation and social distancing exacerbated the global epidemic of violence against women? What are the specific conditions that you see there?
Right. Well, we have a paradox. So, and the paradox, we face this very unusual situation in which the primary advice we're being given to deal with the pandemic, apart from mask wearing and washing our hands and so on, is to isolate as much as possible at home. And in various jurisdictions, people have been under lockdown measures. So, but at the same time, the home is also the most lethal context for women and children and sexual and gender minorities who are experiencing abuse. So I think that all of this is encouraging us to continue to think critically about idealized representations of the home and family, and calling attention to the ongoing relevance of the feminist critique of the family. So the construction of the home and family as a site of safety, as a haven in a heartless world, has really been a core discursive underpinning of quarantine promotion. But for very many women and gender and sexual minorities, the family is really a site of violence and domination. So why is this? Of course, it's because these policies have isolated people from sources of support. We're not interacting with our coworkers. We're not, engaging in normal social interactions. And for those who are facing abusive, intimate relationships, for example, they're being forced into extended periods of time home alone with their abusers. And of course, there is an overlap between the isolation and self-isolation, promotion and quarantine promotion, and isolation and social isolation as a tactic that is very commonly used by abusers. So in context of abuse, victims are very commonly isolated from their family, or from their sources of social support. Some people have argued, for example, Judith Lewis Herman of Harvard University has argued that the isolation tactics that are used by abusers mimic, bear an uncanny resemblance to those that kidnappers use to control hostages. And so I think what we're seeing then is how these quarantine conditions create a kind of ideal atmosphere for coercive control. So while quarantining or staying at home is protecting us from contracting a deadly violence, at the same time these measures are allowing greater freedom to those who engage in abuse, and a context that is shielded from public eyes. So it's, in some senses, I think we could probably say that these measures, these quarantine measures, are hardening the public-private distinctions. They are reprivatizing gender-based violence, and of course, feminists work very, very hard to call attention to the political dimensions of gender-based violence. But these measures are having the effect, I think, of reprivatizing gender-based violence. And of course, there's also the impact for seeking support, because when we're under lockdown or quarantine, or when we're being actively discouraged from leaving our homes, it becomes very, very difficult to reach out for support and help when facing gender-based violence. So people aren't sure whether or not crisis centers and shelters are open, and they're in a context where they're frequently being surveilled by abusers, and that makes it incredibly difficult to reach out for support, even virtually, even online. So a lot of people have talked about how this context is really creating a kind of pressure cooker situation, self-isolation measures, closures of some support systems, and people not knowing that services are still open. So it's a very dangerous situation, and even as, and we can only hope that the pandemic eases, once there is a vaccine, or once there are good treatments for the virus. But I think that this underlying pandemic is likely to persist for a number of reasons that we could talk about. But I think it's really, really important to be paying attention to this pandemic within a pandemic, and how it's being isolated or being intensified by the very measures that are being advocated to keep us safe from the disease.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, as you pointed out, isolation is precisely what perpetrators, try to create. So I'm interested, can you talk a little bit about LGBTQ2S people under the condition of this pandemic, within a pandemic? Is there, what's the kind of, how does this kind of sheltering at home requirement affect that population in a particular way?
Right. So I think it's very, very important for us to be paying attention to how COVID increases gender-based violence for LGBTQ2S people. And there is some preliminary research that is focused on the impact of the pandemic, in particular for young people. A friend of mine was telling me about her daughter is a university student and has a friend from a university residence. And of course, they've all been forced to return home. And this friend is in the process of transitioning. They are not out to their family. Their family is hostile. This young person, therefore, is in a very, very emotionally difficult, abusive context, potentially even a physically abusive context, and really cut off from sources of support, because, of course, for many young gender and sexual minority folks, sources of support are really tied to school or to campus context. So, yeah, you know, a lot of, in particular, a lot of young people are being forced to self-isolate with families who they're not out to and who are potentially hostile to their gender and sexual identities. So this creates, I think, another dimension that is quite dangerous, and we need to be paying attention to this.
Yes, yes. So in the context
of course, I should also mention too, though, that you know, as we know, LGBTQ2S youth are also incredibly overrepresented among homeless youth. And, you know, young people who are homeless and LGBTQ people who are homeless are really facing a lot of difficulties in complying with the message of, you know, staying safe at home without home. So, yeah.
Yes. Yes. So, I mean, what I of course notice is that some people in the context of this rising increase of violence speak of domestic violence, while others like you speak of gender-based violence. So what's the difference in approach that is signaled in these two different terms, and what kind of analysis do you think do we need within the COVID-19 context?
Right. Okay. So did you, Susanna, did you say family violence or domestic violence?
I said domestic violence, but you know, clearly there are all three terms. You know, domestic violence, family violence, gender-based violence, and they all kind of signal to a different approach. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and kind of give us a sense of what, you know, what kind of analysis you think at this moment is really required.
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, I think. I mean, gender-based violence is just a much more inclusive concept. I mean, yes, of course, for example, sexual violence and criminal harassment and child sexual abuse and so on are included when we talk about domestic violence. But domestic violence is a concept that is used to refer to violence that occurs within intimate context. So gender-based violence, though, it includes forms of violence, gender-based violence that occur outside of the intimate context. I do think, though, that in the context of COVID and self-isolation, we do need to be paying particular attention to intimate partner violence because of the impacts of self-isolation for the intensification of intimate partner violence. But gender-based violence is a much more inclusive concept. It includes, you know, more forms of gender-based violence. So, but what kind of approach do we need when we talk about gender-based violence? I think it's really important for us to think about embracing a gender-inclusive but still gendered approach, and also one that is, of course, intersectional. So what do I mean by that? We do need a gender inclusive approach that recognizes, for example, that men can be victimized by gender-based violence, that women can be perpetrators, that trans and non-binary people and sexual minorities experience disproportionate rates of gender-based violence. But even as we embrace gender inclusion, I think it's very, very important that we still attend to the gendered nature of a gender-based violence. So what do I mean by that? A lot of people, in an effort to be inclusive when they're talking about gender-based violence, have advocated that we shift towards a gender-neutral framework. But this makes the relevance of gender and gender disadvantage disappear. It also risks de-individualizing and depoliticizing a problem that is tied to gender norms, that is tied to the celebration of an aggressive form of masculinity. So we need to really be attentive to how gender violence reinforces power relations based on gender, how it reinforces women's inequalities, as well as the disadvantages that are faced by sexual minorities and trans people. Gender violence is a tool of power. Victimization, I think, accumulates in disadvantage. So I think we need to emphasize a structural approach that emphasizes interlocking systems of class and race and gender that perpetuate existing hierarchies of power. And we need to explore how those hierarchies are supported and maintained through gender violence. Sorry, this is a little long-winded.
No, that's important.
So we need to be thinking, in other words, we need to be thinking and talking intersectionally about a gender-based violence. And also, I think it's really important in a settler colonial context, in particular, to pay attention to how gender-based violence has been a central tactic and a tool of colonization. So, you know, as we know, as an outcome of colonization and cultural dislocation, Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQS folks have faced extreme forms of marginalization, including rates of violence that are many times those of other, for example, Canadian women. Violated Indigenous bodies become the raw material for the making of the settler subject and the settler state. And gender violence, sexual violence are tactics of colonization. And when we talk about how gender violence and sexual violence are tactics of colonization, I think we also need to pay careful attention to state violence and police violence as forms of gender-based violence. And, you know, so of course, over the time of the pandemic, we've seen an increase in police violence. We've seen, you know, the killing of two Indigenous racialized women, Regis Korchinski-Paquin in Toronto and Chantel Moore in New Brunswick. And these deaths are reflective of Indigenous women's daily realities embedded within a settler colonial context, a context that has strategically used the criminal justice system to secure and to maintain settler sovereignty. So yeah, we need an approach, therefore, to gender-based violence that is gendered, that calls attention to the links between gender-based violence and social structures, and that is particularly attentive to the impacts or to the way in which gender violence has functioned as a tactic of colonization.
Yes, so I want to kind of follow that up a little bit. I really appreciate you kind of laying out the territory. So does that mean that the term domestic violence has no valence or no value for you? Or do you think that there's a context in which that is a useful term, or does it really, I mean, you said earlier it kind of individualizes and privatizes. And the other question that, you know, from your very interesting kind of elaboration here right now is the term, does the term gender-based violence hide the larger structures of colonialism that you are, you know, I think so very insightfully talked about? Do we need another term? So I want, you know, what's your thought on that?
Well, I mean, you know, I think domestic violence is useful in calling attention to a particular form of gender-based violence.
Okay.
The kind of gender-based violence that takes place within an intimate context. But of course, gender-based violence extends beyond the intimate context. I usually talk about intimate partner violence rather than domestic violence. And And I have a lot of problems with the concept of family violence in particular. I think family violence is it's a very heteronormative concept. Family violence is a concept that is often used in a very degendered way. Family violence is sort of the preferred concept that very mainstream, socially conservative governments use to talk about gender violence in a very degendered way, in a way that not only hides the disproportionate targeting of women for gender-based violence, but completely obscures the violence that is experienced by gender and sexual minorities. And with regard to Indigenous women and to Indigenous two-spirit and non-binary and sexual minority and trans folks, you know, I think the concept that is generally used is gendered colonial violence, which again is, I think, helping to specifically name a form of gender-based violence that is very, very central within a settler colonial context with like Canada. In fact, many people would argue that that colonization and gender-based violence are intimately related in the manner in which they violate the bodies and humanity. That the violation of bodies and humanity, there's a direct. It's not only a tactic of colonization. These are two very similar processes. Colonization does to the land and to sovereignty what gender-based violence does to the bodies of Indigenous people.
Thank you. So you kind of mentioned earlier government and the role of governments in this. And so, I mean, it seems like that in this crisis, we really, yes, we need support services. They are really important frontline support services. But I think, I mean, particularly your work also is kind of calling governments to act and to develop policy. So what kind of policy responses do you think governments need to be embracing right now? I mean, I feel like we hear very little from governments at the moment about this pandemic within a pandemic. We hear about a lot of other things. But so what kind of, what is the role of government here in policy development that you see? It seems to be an urgently called for.
Right. I mean, well, okay. So COVID is, as we've talked about, I think laying bare some of the social structural causes of gender-based violence. We're seeing deepening inequalities in the context of the pandemic, and these are intensifying gender-based violence. There's a direct relationship between social inequality and gender-based violence. In a neoliberal context, and we're having a national and an international conversation today, and some contexts are more neoliberal than others. We exist here in Alberta in the context of a very right-wing government, socially conservative and neoliberal. And what you see happening in the context of neoliberal governance is that gender-based violence is decontextualized from social relations of power, that it's constructed as an individual problem to be solved through individual responsibility and crime control. So when I talk about neoliberal governance, I'm talking about a set of global and national policies that have resulted in the gutting of an already inadequate social safety net and the increased resort to individually focused and punitive responses to social problems and political problems like gender-based violence. But I think as intersectional feminists, we need to call attention again to these social structures that enable and condition gender-based violence. So here in Canada, what we've seen, over the past several years is a coalition of social justice and women's advocacy organizations in particular, who've been calling for a coherent and coordinated and well-resourced national action plan on gender-based violence, a national action plan that would be informed by the outcomes of the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that this needs to be a core plank of Canada's COVID recovery strategy. But we have had a federal government that seems, the federal government has advanced a gender-based violence strategy, but not a coordinated plan that would engage the provinces and the territories. And that is really, really important, because in a Canadian context like Canada, or a federal context like Canada, federalism is really a barrier to having an effective kind of policy response to this complex social problem. So a lot of the areas of jurisdiction that need to be engaged when we're talking about gender-based violence are in provincial jurisdiction. Just to give you an example, affordable housing is something that is really necessary if we're going to craft an effective policy response to gender-based violence. While the federal government has a national housing strategy and a willingness to fund things like shelters and second stage shelters, social policy is in provincial jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's provincial governments who are responsible for providing funding to staff shelters and to staff second stage shelters. So we really do need a coordinated approach that would focus on these social structural causes, that would have benchmarks, that would, where the federal government would effectively use its spending power to induce the provinces and territories to act in a coordinated fashion. This is really, really needed in the Canadian context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So
but
kind of
what we see though is in the context of COVID is governments actually using COVID as an excuse to delay. So the federal government apparently is considering a national action plan, but has been, delayed, has issued statements saying that the pandemic has delayed the development of a national plan. And likewise, the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry reported with calls to action last June. The federal government had committed itself to responding to those calls to action by this June, and has announced that because of COVID, the response is delayed.
Right.
But it is very, very critical that that a national action plan on gender-based violence be a core part of the COVID recovery strategy.
Yes, and I mean, as I hear you speak, I of course immediately worry that there will be no money left, and that this week will become a kind of secondary or third or priority because of the kind of budget situation. So that's very worrisome. Kind of pivoting a little bit, our new favorite word, to pivot. In recent weeks and in previous conversations, we have addressed how this pandemic has affected or affects different communities quite differently. We talked about Black and Indigenous communities and the elevated risk for Black healthcare workers. But of course, we also have witnessed recently the mass protest against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence. So how do we need to think about responses to gender-based violence in the context of Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter? And you have already kind of touched a little bit on that, and I think given us a really kind of way to think about gender-based violence as also a kind of central colonial strategy, and I think that's really helpful. But is there kind of, are there other things you want to add to this? How this discussion is shifting, or we need to think about this maybe differently in the context of Black Lives Matters and Indigenous Lives Matters?
Right. I mean, I do think that, obviously COVID has coincided with the rise of Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter. And well, COVID has also coincided with intensified police violence against racialized communities, Indigenous communities. And really, it's asking us to reimagine the movement against gender violence away from the dominant crime-centered approach, and towards, again, addressing the structural inequalities that condition violence. I think that we could talk about this more, and I won't right now. Maybe someone will ask this, but I do think that the movement against gender-based violence has been caricatured as being carceral feminist, and this is something that I take issue with, because you know, in some of my work, I've looked at the history of feminist campaigns in Canada against violence against women. And I have to say that those campaigns were always primarily focused on social policy and on addressing these social structural conditions that enable violence, rather than on crime control. And that feminist activists in Canada at least have always had a critique of the law and order state. But I think that it's really, really important in this current context that we, again, pivot, I'll use that word, away from crime control as the predominant policy response, that we engage in self-conscious coalitions. That, I'm an anti-violence activist, I'm a feminist activist, that we engage in self-conscious coalitions with other social justice organizations and movements, and in particular with Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter. And we're beginning to see this. I mean, I think if you look at the websites of many national advocacy organizations now, you will see many statements of support for Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter. I do think that it is very, very important that we acknowledge police violence as being an important manifestation of gender-based violence, that we embrace alternative forms of justice beyond criminal justice, that we experiment with community justice and transformative justice, that we move away from this kind of crime control framework. That said, though, I think it is important for us to acknowledge that there are legitimate needs for safety and justice, and that we will have to continue to engage with the criminal legal system, even as we shift to focus on social policy responses. Like the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry had a number of calls to action focused on improving justice responses to gender-based violence and gendered colonial violence. So I don't think that we can completely turn away from demands to improve the criminal legal system, even though I think that we certainly have to refocus on social policy responses to gender-based violence and to stronger coalitions with anti-racist, Indigenous, and anti-poverty movements. So that's the way I'd like to see, our politics developing.
So, I mean, that's, kind of to follow up with that a little bit, because the role of the police right now is really in the public discussion, right? I mean, Edmonton City Council had nearly a whole week where people were testifying of what the role of the police should be in Edmonton, what the police budgets should be. So, and when we were putting together the resource list that for some reason didn't get posted right now, the question was, should we put 911, which is the police call, on our resource list for people who are looking for services or support or need to respond to incidences of violence or experience with violence. So you see a role for the police. What is the role for police for you in the context, of the topic of gender-based violence, given the kind of, at the moment, the really kind of big debate of what is the role of police in cities, right?
Right. I mean, I think that we need to continue to demand that police accountability and that police actually serve the justice and safety needs of all members of the community, including women and racialized people, Indigenous people, and queer people. But you know, many anti-violence activists and scholars working on, you know, I'm someone who works on sexual violence in law. Many of my colleagues have turned away from, you know, our decades-long fight to improve criminal legal responses to sexual violence, and we're beginning to think very seriously about alternative justice measures instead. But even so, we can't abandon criminal law. You know, we just had another incident in another death, another violent death of an Edmonton racialized immigrant woman who was killed by her intimate partner. This man had been arrested on 3 previous occasions, and he'd been released on bail with a restraining order. He had assaulted, over this period, he had assaulted this woman's 17-year-old son, and ultimately this woman was killed on the weekend. So we can't ignore that people have legitimate needs for protection and safety, but how we get the police and the criminal law system to respond, to actually serve the justice needs of the community in a manner that is respectful and that respects people's charter rights, it's a problem, because, you know, as I said, you know, it's something we've been working on for 4 decades, and we haven't made much progress in improving criminal justice responses. So
Thank you.
it's frustrating, but I think we can't say that, you know, I realize that the call to defund the police has been completely misunderstood. And I think the call to defund the police is actually quite consistent with the kind of political approach that I've laid out here, which is a shift away from criminal law and a shift towards focusing on social policy responses, a shift away from neoliberalism and a shift towards focusing on ameliorating social disadvantage and equality. At the same time, there is a need for, we can't discount that you know, people are facing what are often life-threatening situations. So
okay, yes, thank you, Lise. We have a bit of time for some questions, and I see that some people have already kind of moved to the Q&A section on your screen on the bottom. There are a few questions that I will have to lift my glasses to actually read them. This is middle age. So one of the questions that I see here is makes reference to the shooting spree and the mass shootings in Nova Scotia in April, where the perpetrator began by attacking his girlfriend and then killing many more people, women and men, in his way, and then ended killing his ex-wife. Though I had known that it was his ex-wife who was killed. And this audience member asked the question of, you know, what do we do with the unwillingness of the police to call this violence against women? You know, that it started with the girlfriend, it kind of clearly moved, you know, it wasn't just women who were the victims here. But of course, in the Canadian memory, the Monterey Massacre stands out as this kind of, what is the word, as this kind of moment of, you know, that kind of, I really think brought the debate about what do we call violence against women, and what do we recognize as violence against women, and violence against feminists in that case brought that to the forefront. But why is there, so this audience member asked, why is there still so much trouble to identify gender-based violence as gender-based violence and call it, you know, familial violence? So what's the reluctance here, particularly in this case, I guess, by the police? Do you have any kind of thoughts on that, please?
Well, I mean, there is huge resistance. You know, this whole pandemic has been punctuated by many, many horrific acts of, and let's label it, male violence. Mm-hmm. So I was actually in Nova Scotia during the Portapique mass killing, and as the audience member has said, you know, this was Canada's largest mass shooting. It began with a brutal attack on this man's current intimate partner. He killed his former intimate partner in the course of, killing 22 other people. And he had been previously reported to the RCMP for domestic violence against his intimate partner. But this was ignored. There were many flags that were ignored, but this was one that was ignored. There was one study there's a recent study that shows that of something like more than 700 mass shootings between 2014 and 2019, 60% of the perpetrators had documented histories of domestic violence, and yet we continually, or I should say that law enforcement and government policymakers seem to be continually ignoring these links between intimate partner violence, misogyny, and mass killing. We see this also in terms of the reluctance to take into account intimate partner violence in family law decisions around the custody of children, resulting in really tragic and preventable deaths. This child who was killed during the pandemic by her father. The mother of the child had experienced and had a documented history of domestic violence, but judges seem to not understand that there are links between intimate violence against partners and a propensity towards other acts of violence. So I don't know. It's incredibly frustrating. It seems like the worse the brutality, the less certain we are that what we're seeing is violence against women or gender-based violence. The narrative always seems to be, oh, the person just snapped. Gender violence seems to be persistently individualized, blamed on mental illness. This is something that feminists identified as being a problem in the 1980s, and things haven't shifted despite an enormous amount of research and advocacy work. So I don't know what the answer is here. I don't know why that is. I mean, I think honestly that we would have to make very radical changes in the conduct of law enforcement and if not in the structure of society, in order to truly recognize in order to truly identify and name gender-based violence. It's a widespread problem.
Right. Yes. And that reluctance clearly also resonates across the media. I mean, it is absolutely astounding how violence gender-based violence gets reported in the media. I mean, in the ways that you have lined out. There are a couple of questions from people, and I'm going to summarize them a little bit, that are people who are working either for, in the corporate context or in the university context, the student association, asking some kind of suggestions of what can be the role of the kind of corporate sector or university student organizations, kind of institutions like the university, like corporations. What can be the role, in your view, to kind of address gender-based violence? Do they have a role to play? Are there any kind of suggestions that you have, what organizations can do to address gender-based violence?
Well, obviously, I think institutions require awareness raising. People need to understand the pervasiveness of this problem, its many dimensions, and be able to identify situations in which colleagues or students may be being targeted for violence. I think that what we're seeing is in terms of public policy, governments requiring domestic violence leaves. This would be at a public policy level. This would have an impact for all employers, but employers themselves, and in terms of contract negotiations, for example, in unionized contexts, can develop policies providing leaves for gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. You know, in the context of universities, we've seen a pretty massive, which is a whole other conversation. We've seen a massive effort to try to put in place effective policies to deal with the very huge problem of sexual violence. There's a lot we can be doing, but it has to start with naming the problem and with understanding the links between gender-based violence and forms of inequality. Again, we need to move away from these individualized frameworks. They don't explain the problem and they don't produce effective solutions.
Right, right. Yes, thank you. So there's another question that I will expand a little bit on. So this is a question that that I'm also very interested in. So you mentioned early on that of gender-based violence, of course, includes violence against men. Right? And I sometimes see kind of two polarities, either a kind of denial of violence against men, or, you know, when violence against men and men as victims of gender-based violence comes up, it's like, oh, everybody's equally a victim of violence.
Right.
Right? So do you have some, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How to, you know, how can we, on the one hand, I think need to acknowledge the men, particularly gay men, but also cis heterosexual men who can be victims of violence without falling into this, oh, we're all humans and we're just, or, you know, everybody can become a victim of violence. Do you have a way to kind of navigate through that?
And that's why I, you know, advocate for a gender inclusive but still gendered approach. I mean, we do need to recognize, and we need to recognize men as victims of gender-based violence. As I said, most of my work focuses on sexual violence, so I'll talk about that more specifically. But we need to recognize that men are victims of sexual violence, not just usually it's sexual violence enacted by other men, but it can also be enacted by women. It's not something that occurs obviously as frequently as sexual violence is enacted on women's bodies, but we need to make space for male survivors. We need to acknowledge their experience. We need to think about some of the causes and some of the ways in which sexual violence enacted by women on men may be different or the same as male perpetrated sexual violence against women. But I mean, obviously, when you look at the statistics, it's very clear that, you know, just by recognizing sexual violence against men, you obviously also have to pay attention to the greater the pervasiveness of violence against women, and also to the manner in which violence against women is used to reinforce women's structural disadvantage in a way that doesn't happen quite in the same way when men are sexually victimized, for example, by women, right? It's not something that reinforces their gender disadvantage. So, but we need services that are welcoming to male victims without diluting the services that need to be available for women victims, right, and for trans and non-binary victims who are also disproportionately targeted.
Right. So we're coming nearly to the end of our, yes, we are actually at the end of our time. I want to thank you, Lise, for taking the time today and for this kind of really fulsome discussion or conversation about the pandemic within the pandemic, and the kind of, I think you really brought home again to, you know, that we need a structural approach to this, and which, you know, something that I think we often kind of lose sight of, and governments, but also organizations are called upon. So I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to our audience. I also want to thank Rachel Sukivsky and Betty Lee, who are working with Intersections of Gender, who helped making this event possible. And for those of you who either missed parts of it or who want to review some of what Dr. Gotell talked about today, we will make the taping of this event today available both as a video, as a text, and as a sound file. And you can find that on our webpage, Intersections of Gender, in the next few days. We will also notify everybody who signed up for this event today that these files are available. So you can access this later. So thank you so very much. And we will also share the resources that somehow didn't come through today.
I also just wanted to say, Susanna, thank you for doing this. It was a great conversation. And if we could save the question and answer file, and if contact information is available for people and I didn't get to any questions, I'm happy to, or people can email me as well. I'm happy to answer any questions by email that we didn't get to. So maybe we'll do it that way. That's easier.
That might be easier. Yeah. Thank you so much. So you can find Dr. Gotell's email address by just going to the University of Alberta or by Googling her. The information is widely available. I think it's Gotell, right, at ualberta.ca.
Yeah.
But you can also find Dr. Gotell on the UAlberta webpage. So thank you so very much, and take good care of yourself and each other. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lise. Bye, everyone.